And on behalf of CSR and the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, I'd like to welcome you all this afternoon to Resolving the Irish Conflict. No conflict is intractable. This lecture is part of our long-running, co-sponsored lecture series, The Crossroads of Religion and Politics. And this afternoon, we look forward to probing the intersection of these two often contentious forces. Now, to introduce today's speaker, it is my privilege to welcome the Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, Christina Paxson. Dean Paxson is the Hughes Rogers Professor of Economics and Public Affairs and the founder of the Center for Health and Well-Being. Dean Paxson.
Thank you for joining us today for our very first public affairs talk of the year, and we are very honored to have such a wonderful start with a speaker like Gerry Adams, who's president of Sinn Féin. Today's lecture is titled Resolving the Irish Conflict, No Conflict is Intractable. And it's the first in a series of lectures that we're going to have this year on intractable conflicts. This talk and others that follow it will highlight crisis-ridden regions that have made significant progress towards achieving peace. Today's talk is also part of the Crossroads of Religion and Politics series, which we co-sponsor with CSR. Sinn Féin translates to we ourselves. Our speaker has spent a lifetime trying to make this a reality in Ireland. While his efforts and his goal of a united Ireland have not been without controversy, I think we can all agree that his work has been solely focused on achieving Sinn Féin's motto of unity, equality, and prosperity. Born in Belfast, Northern Ireland in 1948, Adams became involved in predominantly Roman Catholic civil rights protests in Belfast in his teens, and in 1964 joined Sinn Féin, the political wing of the Irish Republican Army. I think it's fair to say that during the 1960s and early 1970s, Ireland truly was an example of an intractable conflict. While some applauded the work of Sinn Féin and Adams, others strongly disapproved. In 1972, following 2 years of escalating violence by the IRA and Protestant paramilitary forces, Adams was interned without a trial. While he was soon released to participate in secret talks that led to a brief ceasefire between the British Army and the IRA, he was again imprisoned in 1973 to 76 and 1978, and later officially charged, though never convicted, of membership in the IRA. In the late 1970s, Adams began to advocate for a more political, peaceful strategy, asserting that victory by military force was unlikely, and in 1983 was elected president of Sinn Féin. Employing his strategy of unity, achieved through peaceful measures, Adams engaged in a series of secret talks in the late 1980s and early 1990s with John Hume, leading to a 1993 joint statement to the British and Irish governments that outlined points of agreement and conditions under which Sinn Féin would be willing to participate in multi-party talks. In January 1994, after years of being denied entry by the US government, Adams was granted a visa to the United States. The move helped bring Sinn Féin closer to political legitimacy and led to an 18-month IRA ceasefire beginning in August of that year. In September 1997, Adams joined multi-party talks to end the conflict in Northern Ireland, and he supported the Good Friday Agreement of April 1998 that outlined steps that led to a power-sharing self-government in the province. Adams gained international stature as a peacemaker in 2005 for his part in the historic announcement that the IRA would denounce violence and seek a peaceful resolution to the sectarian conflict in Northern Ireland. March 2007 marked yet another milestone for Adams when he met with Ian Paisley of the Protestants' Democratic Unionist Party to form a joint governmental platform. While some would argue that peace in Ireland has not been completely achieved, it is light years ahead of where it was 45 years ago when Gerry Adams began his work with Sinn Féin. We look forward today to hearing about what has turned this intractable conflict into one where peace is a realistic vision, and we hope to learn lessons that we could apply to other conflicts around the globe. So please help me welcome Gerry Adams.
Thank you, vi sin go hand flahol, will Inyan Shaw or Anybody here from Ireland? From Italy? I want to start, just if I may, by thanking Christina and the Woodrow Wilson School, and Jenny from the Centre for the Study of Religion, and Elizabeth Donovan, who's here also, and anybody else who helped to make this engagement possible. And always just in the moments before I come to a speaking engagement, and you know there's no way to get out of the room, that you have to start, I'm always a wee bit undecided whether I should stick by the script or just try and deal with this as thoughts tumble through my brain. We're only after coming from New York after what I thought was a very, very meaningful and insightful and uplifting session of the Clinton Global Initiative. We met for three days, and there were people there. Your president was there, the First Lady was there, President Clinton himself was there, and speakers from throughout the third, second and first world, from the developing world, talking about big issues, from natural disasters to conflict to all the social inequities and inequalities. And one of the things that struck me when you compare the situation in Ireland today, and it's far from perfect on the sort of measurement scale, we're in a far better place than many other parts of this planet and many other sectors of humanity. So the title is Intractable Conflicts, and you know, my notional view, and I hope that I can prove this, is that no conflict is intractable. I mean, conflicts don't just happen out of the air. There's a reason, there's a cause for a conflict. And in many cases, the causes are similar. One of the big causes for conflict throughout the world is colonialism. That's probably an old-fashioned term. And you cannot understand anything about Irish history, or anything about what happened in Ireland, or anything about the Irish, unless you can understand the conquest by an English government of Ireland. And whether you did that 800 years ago, or 400 years ago, or 200 years ago, is a bit immaterial. The fact is that our nearest neighbours, or at least their government, decided for all sorts of reasons to take ownership of the island of Ireland, and because it's interesting that no imperial power or no colonial power ever tells it as it is. They don't say we went and took that place because of the oil, or we went and took that place because we needed wood for our ships, or we went and took that place because we needed natural resources, or because we wanted strategically to guard our flank. In our case, they said that they came to civilize the barbarians. That's why they came to our small island. And, at that time, there's an old sort of, maybe I shouldn't say this, if anybody here from the diplomatic corps, Ireland was Ireland and England was a pup. Ireland will be Ireland when England's buggered up. We had a country, a culture, a language, a system which was progressive, which was democratic, and so on, and which had certain core values. And conquest has to happen in the mind, because even though you may take possession of people's land or homes or any of that, there'll still always be within people's heads the sense of rebelliousness, the sense of uprising, the sense of resistance to that, unless you can colonise the mind. So language gets targeted, customs get targeted, traditions get targeted, core values get targeted. And I think it's to the great, I suppose, credit of Irish people that we have never lost the thirst for justice and the thirst for self-governance, our own place, and that is particularly within Irish America. It's always very edifying for me. I meet people here who are third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation Irish, and they still care deeply about what's happening back in Ireland, and they still retain, and particularly in these days of internet, a very informed view of what's going on. So that's just trying to sketch out. If you bring all of that fast forward into the last sort of measurable chunk of our recent history, the last 100 years, Ireland was partitioned. The Irish rebelled in every generation. There were agrarian agitation, there were civil agitation, there was agitation for rights, for emancipation, there was repression, there was Gorta Mór, which was the Great Hunger, which indeed caused many people from Ireland to come to this Illian Uair, what was called in the Irish language the New Island. There was in 1916 the proclamation by the Irish, or a section of the Irish, of a republic. And that proclamation is in many ways the mission statement of modern Irish republicanism. And it drew upon the French revolutionary tradition and the American revolutionary tradition. I mean, this Princeton University has been affected by Ireland, by Scots-Irish who came here, who were forced to leave Ireland, and who actually founded the university here. Those who stayed behind, we're back 200 years now, formed the United Irish Movement, and that was the first Republican movement. And there's a continuity between that early movement and the Republic which was declared in 1916. And interestingly enough, and I only got this just on the way down in the car, Woodrow Wilson was very clear on the injustice of English rule in Ireland. He, as you all know, established the League of Nations and was being lobbied by Irish Republican leaders after 1916. The Republic, which was declared in 1916, was suppressed, and there was a very, very bloody war, followed by a civil war, followed by the partition of the island. But in the New York Times in 1921, I have my friend here, Larry Downs, who is the president of Friends of Sinn Féin in the USA, came across this. He remembers reading it at the time in 1921. But Woodrow Wilson said that he was of the opinion that the Irish problem could not be settled by force, for the spirit of Ireland, which for centuries had been demanding justice, was unconquerable. He went on to say the policy of force and reprisal, which the English government had for centuries practiced, had but strengthened the tenacious purpose of the Irish people. And he said the whole policy of Great Britain and its treatment of the Irish question has been based upon a policy of fear and not a policy of trusting the Irish people. And I've tried to impress upon the Englishmen with whom I have discussed this matter that there can never be a real comradeship between America and England until this issue is definitely settled and out of the way. So there are echoes. I often see Irish history in a certain degree because we're not making our own history. We still haven't got control of our own affairs, so we're not entirely making our own history, as a bit of a cul-de-sac. And these echoes bounce, So I I come here and I knew a wee bit about Woodrow Wilson, but just on the way down in the car, this man could have come and given this talk today because he understood that the English government treated the Irish people dreadful, and that was not a good policy. That was a bad policy, that then caused the conflict. So, get to the root cause of the conflict. From our position, from a democratic position, it is English government interference in Irish affairs. Now, the question of religion, the conflict in Ireland is oftentimes depicted as a religious conflict. It is not a religious conflict. There is a sectarian edge to it. The plantation of Ireland was the first time ever that a colonial power used the technique of plantation as a means of conquest. What happened was that those who came in the first instance became, the historians tell us, more Irish than the Irish themselves. They intermarried, they adopted some of the native customs and so on and so forth. So there had to be another way of doing it. So they dispossessed native people and they handed over that land to those who come in, if you like, as a garrison class. And that garrison class then had a real big reason to fight and to be separate and to stay away from falling into any local conspiracies, because it was their own land they were defending, land they had been gifted by the English crown. And just by an accident, the vast majority of people in Ireland were Catholic, and these planters were Protestant. And therein rises the notion that this is a religious conflict because one section happened to be Catholic, the big native section, and the others happened to be Protestant. What most people don't know is that the first United Irish, those who founded the Republican movement, those who came here, were mostly Protestant, were Church of Ireland, or Church of England, and Presbyterian. So the founding fathers and mothers of Irish republicanism were those who believed in the emancipation of Catholic, Protestant and dissenter, and who were avowedly anti-Catholic. Now, when the Republic was suppressed in 1916 when Ireland was partitioned, two conservative states were established on the island, in both parts of the island. But the one we deal with mostly here today is the one in the north. And it could not be retained. Ireland is a very small landmass. It's about the size of the state of Maine. We have less than 6 million people. The population's on the increase, but even 10 or 15, 20 years ago, you could have easily just said 5 million people. You would lose the population of Ireland in one of your big cities here. You would lose the island in one of your great lakes. We're a very, very small place. So the wee bit that I live in, there could only be a maintenance of political control if those who were put in charge had almost absolute power onto themselves. So what we had was an orange state. The Prime Minister of the day described it as a Protestant Parliament for a Protestant people. He said, I wouldn't have a Catholic about the place. You can imagine that someone saying that in your country about some grouping. Many people may think it, but very few would, as Prime Minister, would say it. And then there were a whole series of discriminations. Catholics didn't have the right to vote in local government elections. The gerrymandering of areas, which had clearly a majority of people who would have voted nationalist, but year after year, election after election, ended up with a unionist dominated council and so on. Now, there's a reason for all of that. And the reason was power. It wasn't because people hated Catholics, although maybe some did, and maybe some Catholics hated Protestants as well. But that wasn't the reason for it. The reason was to maintain the power. And at working class level and lower working class level particularly, there was no advantage for unions. You know, I represent West Belfast. West Belfast includes the Shankill Road. The Shankill Road is a very proud working class unionist heartland. The social and economic conditions are exactly the same as on the Falls Road. So those who benefited most were the landed gentry, the bosses, the manufacturing classes, the military leaders, you know, the old boys network. And it could not endure. It was just impossible that people would have put up with those type of just indignities. You know, advertisements in the newspapers. This is when I was maybe 14 or 15. Advertisements for jobs which said no Catholic need apply. There's an echo of that here. I have a little thing which a woman from Boston gave me which said no Irish need apply, which I have at home. So sectarianism is the second cousin of racism. And racism again has a rationale. You know, some people may hate people because they're a different skin colour, but most of that's based on ignorance. Most of that's based upon fear. But those who actually stoke it do so to keep people divided and do so to keep control. And sectarianism in the north of Ireland was not just about keeping Catholics under control, but it was also about keeping Protestants under control. And it was also about trying to prevent people coming together in common interest issues. So, as a teenager going to school in 1964, I was 16 at the time. There was an election. I didn't know an awful lot about politics. I was fairly conscious of my Irishness. I was reared in a household which was Irish, not in an in-your-face way, but you know, we were just comfortable that we knew who we were. I wasn't dreadfully politically conscious at all, even though I can trace Republican politics on my maternal and paternal side back for some generations. But I was going to school one day and the election was being contested by Sinn Féin, and Sinn Féin then was banned. If you're interested in a bit of research, Google the Special Powers Act, Northern Ireland. And the Special Powers Act was described as by Foster, who was a Prime Minister in South Africa, as something that he would set aside all the apartheid laws if he could have the Special Powers Act. You know, in the 1960s, people could be flogged, people could be held without trial and war, and every single year from 1920 right up until whenever internment ended, 1976 or 77. People could be detained, newspapers were banned, gramophone, that's for those who have iPods, gramophones are the old vinyl records which would have had Irish patriotic songs or national songs were banned, little emblems were banned. So we going back and forth to school saw in a shop window election posters for a Republican candidate and the Irish flag. And then Ian Paisley announced that the Irish flag, which was also illegal, wasn't taken out of the window, that he would come and see if he could take it out himself. And he demanded that the police take it out, which the police did. And the Republicans put it back in again, and the police took it out again, and we watched all this, and there was 2 or 3 days of civil disturbances. And I went and got the Special Powers Act as a kid, to read it. And then I got a rationale as I read more and more and more as to why we were living in fair housing, why most of the men weren't in work, why people had their heads down, why so many people had to go for work to Birmingham or London or Liverpool or somewhere else, and why the people in the Shankill who looked exactly the same as us were maybe a wee bit different from us. And 1966 was the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, and there was a big boom in the writings of the leaders of that rising. All of the leaders were executed by the British. But Padraig Pearse and particularly James Connolly had written about equality issues, about justice issues, about social issues, about independence, about humanity, about people's rights, and so on. James Connolly incidentally spent considerable time here in the States working with the labour movement here before he went back to Ireland and became a labour organiser and a leader of the rising. And then what was happening in the world? There was anti-apartheid protests, there was anti-Vietnam War protests, there were student protests in Europe, there was Bob Dylan and the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, and for the Irish there were a revival of Irish music, of Flá Ceolna, folk music, traditional Sean Nós music of our country, and we just got caught up in all that in the 60s and modelled, I was only again a young man, the civil rights movement on the American model, even stole the anthem, watched Rosa Parks, watched Martin Luther King, went to anti-Vietnam War protests, went to anti-apartheid protests, and very naively. And I remember when I learned this lesson, I thought all these things were happening because those in power didn't really know. And if you just brought it to their attention, that it was just so compelling, it was just so obvious that they would sort it out. And in 1969, I realised that that wasn't the case, that this wasn't an accident, that those in power, in fact, were either the creators of, or they were perpetuating those injustices in order to stay in power, or because they feared, just the freedom or the type of society that it would be possible to have if people were all treated properly and decently and with dignity. So, 69 was, in my opinion, when the British state in Ireland collapsed. And the British state rushed British soldiers in, and that's the recipe for complete disaster. In any situation where politicians give the responsibility over to military people, because with respect to military people are in charge, they set the rules, that they are there to kill, that's what they're there for, the pacification of people, that's what all armed forces, that's their purpose, no matter how they disguise it, and sometimes they do it in a good cause, and sometimes they do it in a very, very bad cause. But when politicians, when diplomats, when those in charge step back and say to the generals, now you run the show, it's a recipe just for total disaster. Wherever it is, even in a country as savage as this United States, if the president stepped aside and put whoever the general is in charge, it would be a recipe for disaster. In Ireland, given our history, it's even more so, given the tradition of resistance, and given all this echo, fast forward from 1918 to 1971. Bloody Sunday in 1918 or 1919 in Dublin, Bloody Sunday in 1971, 1972. and all the other incidences that have occurred throughout the 30 years. So, I was one of those people I supported and defended. I've never distanced myself from the IRA. I think it was a legitimate response in conditions where really people were just being subjected to dreadful abuse. And it's a bit hard to explain. And there was a program on television back home just last week, which looked at some of the things that occurred about 20 years ago, and some of the more horrible things that happened. And I got scared watching the program. It was just a reminder of how bad things were. Now, it's a low intensity war. It wasn't, it wasn't a full scale conflict. 3,000 people died, which is 3,000 people too many. But by comparison with what happens elsewhere, some would argue that it's small, a small conflict, but it just seared the lives and scarred the lives of everybody. The British ran the place as a armed military camp. And for people who are pacifistic, and I have a great admiration for people who are pacifistic, if you can imagine whatever your neighbourhood is at home, and just imagine an army from anywhere coming in and taking over the local sports halls, the local community centres as garrisons, bringing in all the military equipment, the choppers, the heavy vehicles, the tons and tons and tons and tons of armed infantry. This isn't trench warfare. This isn't. These are into housing estates, into city centres, into towns, into small villages, into most beautiful rural glens and valleys and mountainsides. And then armies do what armies do. They stop you, they ill-treat you, they order you about, and even the most docile person. If I turned now and suddenly seized Christina and pushed her up against that wall and spread eagled her, you would be outraged. Just outraged. If your home was raided at 5 o'clock in the morning and wrecked, the house I lived in, my family lived in Balmorby, had to be actually demolished eventually. It was taken over by the British, and they destroyed it. They just totally and absolutely destroyed it. They urinated on the beds. They shit in the wardrobes. They destroyed everything in the house that could be broken down and destroyed. And that happened to tens of thousands of families. So little wonder that there was resistance to all of that, and that people responded, or at least some people responded to that with our actions. Now, if you keep coming back to conflict and what conflict's about, it's not religious, and there's a cause of it. And if you have war and you look for a military solution, there are no military solutions to what are essentially political problems. Well, you may be able to defeat for some time, or to subdue, or to contain, or to pacify, or but you won't bring in a solution based upon military means. You won't bring in a settlement based upon military means. And I said that in the late 1970s, that there was no military victory. There was no military way forward. There had to be a political solution. Now, just to try and compress, because I don't want to be speaking for too long. The problem is breaking the cycle. There were tens of thousands of people who were imprisoned. I was imprisoned. I was imprisoned without trial. I tried to escape from imprisonment without trial, and then I was tried for trying to escape from and I was put back in prison, and I'm a slow learner, so I tried to escape again. And I'm also a very bad escapee. Steve McQueen is not me, so. But just to give you some sense of what this would mean if it happened in your country, Bishop McCauley quite kind to give me statistics, which If there was a similar level of conflict here in the USA as there was in the north of Ireland, and remember what I've said now, it was a fairly small conflict in comparison to what happened in other places. But it would have meant there would have been 750,000 dead if it happened here. Millions injured and millions of people imprisoned. So you can see how that would have a huge effect here, and how the number and the effects of all of that has scarred, as I've said earlier, people who live in the conflict zone. So what are the difficulties? Well, first of all, if Sinn Féin is suppressed, which it was banned. It was a banned organisation. It's very difficult to build a mass movement or to build a political party underground, particularly in a war zone. It might be when there's no war, easier to do, but when there's a war, and when the military have just complete and absolute carte blanche to do nearly what they want, it's very, very difficult, because people are afraid and intimidated and all the time. We use an expression back home, on the run. You know, that you're on your keep. You're living from house to house, from safe place to safe place. But we started to focus in on what was required, and we looked at other struggles. Now I'm short-circuiting our history. I'm skipping over the hunger strikes. I'm skipping over many of the big atrocities that occurred on all sides, including the IRA, the British, all the Unionist allies of the British were involved in actions which were dreadful. But I'm just skipping over all of that. But we started to just ask, well, how do you get peace? How do you do it? By this time, I'm an elected official. I represent the people of West Belfast. But the British government refused to recognise my mandate, which is fair enough. I didn't take that personally. But more importantly, they refused to recognise the right of the electorate to elect someone like me. They wouldn't talk. So how do you make peace? How do you work it when, if you want to break the cycle, when the other side won't talk? Sinn Féin was censored. The broadcasting authorities were forbidden from carrying Sinn Féin statements, from carrying interviews with Sinn Féin. In fact, some of you may remember the bizarre situation where Margaret Thatcher banned my voice and the voice of other Sinn Féin representatives. And some clever people who were against us in the BBC tried to get around that by using actors' voices. Some of you will remember that some people said it was a great improvement in my case. It's a bit bizarre to hear a Scottish accent explaining Sinn Féin policy. But I mean, these are strange, funny things. But imagine, you know, how do you articulate? How do win support for? How do you explain? How do you inform? How do you reach out to people who may be progressive or might want to help, might have some understanding that these things can be sorted out? So we look to the international community and to other struggles and international dimensions of other struggles. To any successful liberation struggle has been in many cases very, very crucial. And we look to ourselves, to the Irish, to all those people who were all over the world as part of the diaspora, and particularly here in the United States of America. And organisations like NORAID and Clan na Gael and the Ancient Order of the Hibernians and numerous other organisations who have kept the faith with Ireland, and individuals and just families who have kept the faith. And we look to them because the Irish are most well organised here. You mightn't think it, those of you who are Irish, but the Irish are most well organised here, and they're a very powerful lobby here in the USA. And I often use what I'm now going to say as an example, and I say this particularly to young people, but to everybody. One person, this is the cliche, can make a difference. A guy called John Derry in New York, and some of his friends had an idea to hold a presidential forum and to invite the candidates in to answer questions on the Irish issue. Now, every one of us, at some time in our lives, and some of us maybe 100 times in our lives, have seen something on TV or been moved by something and had the bright idea, I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to write a letter, I'm going to get in touch with somebody, I'm going to lobby, and you don't do it. Wake up the next day, you're living a busy life, and you don't do it. But these guys did it. And the presidential office came, and they were asked, would they support a visa for me? Would they support McBride principles, which were about ending discrimination in jobs? Would they look for probes into state killings and collusion by state forces? And they said yes. And Bill Clinton was one of them. And he was elected, and the people who had organised that forum, they went back to him and said, Bill, remember? And he said yes, and the rest is history. He started looking at some of these issues. A small group of people came together here. They represented corporate America, the labour movement, wide section. I suppose only maybe 4 or 5 people, but representing a huge sort of raft of opinion, and they started to engage with us. We had, by this point, also opened up discussions with the Irish government, who wouldn't meet with us, but we did it through an intermediary, and the British government, which was at that time pursuing a relentless campaign, then opened up a back channel, as they call it, with us. And I was talking to John Hume, who was the leader of the SDLP. So we had this very complicated, convoluted, imperfect, worst possible means of trying to communicate and to build. And John Hume did a wonderful job. He was vilified for even talking to me, even though I was a member of Parliament. He was a member of Parliament, and the most natural thing would be to talk to each other. And that then led to what are called the Hume-Adams proposals, which we put together as a means of breaking the cycle that I described earlier on. And it met with huge support in Ireland, even though most people never saw the Hume-Adams proposals. There was just a sense that this was something good, serious effort, it was inclusive, it was the first time, and I suppose representing where I came from, representing where John came from, it was seen, as a good ticket to be going forward on. The Downing Street Declaration was an attempt to thwart that. It's actually an attempt by the government at the time in London to settle for less than was required. And it took years to get to the point where we eventually, with the active support of the US government, under the stewardship in Ireland of Senator George Mitchell, that the Good Friday Agreement talks commenced. John Major, when the IRA called its for cessation, said Sinn Féin would have to go through a process of decontamination. He said that his stomach would turn at the thought of talking to us, even though he knew that his officials were talking with us. So out of all of that learning experience, there then becomes sort of fairly clear, if you watch it, some indications, or it's probably a bit too highfalutin to call them principles, but some essentials if you want to make conflict end. Dialogue is central. If I was asked to describe in one word what is required to bring peace, it's dialogue. And by dialogue I mean genuine, proactive listening, as well as talking. It isn't talking at people, it's talking to people, it's listening to people. It's being inclusive, it's not blocking out, it's not dictating who should represent who. Each side has the right to decide whoever's going to represent them. It's not being able to take certain issues off the agenda or limit the agenda to certain issues. You might get all the issues resolved, and indeed you might even get all the issues addressed, but everybody should have the ability to bring forward their issues to be dealt with if it's possible. So dialogue is crucial. You see, and once you take a decision to dialogue, then it all starts to change. I often use the example of Nelson Mandela. Mandela was described as a terrorist, a criminal, a gangster, and then all of a sudden he became president of South Africa. So how could you keep describing him as a terrorist, as a gangster, as a criminal? He was the president. And once you start to talk to people, none of us, and Mandela actually said this talking to the ANC were given off to him because he was being nice to the Afrikaners. And he said, look, I want to talk to them. If I call them out of their name, if I describe them as racist and describe, that's not going to impress them. I might think all those things, but I'll keep that to myself. We'll go and talk. So all these little sort of, lazy stigmas that are put upon people, like terrorists, like gangsters, like criminals, all that has to be dispensed with if you're going to be serious about what you're at. And there needs to be political will. Sometimes a lot of lazy journalists and historians talk about trust. There needs to be trust. There doesn't need to be trust. Who trusts who? In this world, especially in a conflict situation, when you're trying to, if you're going to wait for trust, you wait for a very long time. Trust is an objective, not a condition. And the quicker you get it, the better. But I mean, it can't be. Husbands don't trust their wives don't trust their husbands, business partners don't trust each other, people in politics don't trust each other. So enemies locked into aggression, abusing each other, hurting, killing, injuring each other, aren't going to trust each other as a first goal. But what they have to do is deal with each other. And then you can construct all sorts of interesting dimensions to talks. It isn't a matter of somebody like me standing up here and talking for the length of time I'm talking at an audience. It's a matter of getting quiet time, of trying to develop. I mean, I often tell the story that some of my best conversations with unionists were in the men's room because they wouldn't talk when anybody else was about. But every so often you'd meet an individual unionist in the men's room and you could say, hello, how you doing? Are you well? And they'd have a good a good conversation. And then people get to know each other a wee bit. You know, get to know, you know, they've got kids or they've got parents, and then people start to see persons, start to see character, start to see personalities, start to see human beings. And when you get to that point, then, you know, it's a matter of negotiation. So, the powerful elements in this, and this is not for a second to take away responsibility from those who rise up against governments, because we also have our huge responsibilities, both morally and politically and every other way. But governments particularly have a huge responsibility. A huge responsibility. When a government conspires to kill its own citizens, when a government conspires to use its forces to kill its own citizens, that's a huge subversion of society. So governments have a huge responsibility in terms of reaching out. The international community has a huge responsibility. The CGI that I was talking about earlier on, you know, somebody just trotted off this figure. In Africa, every 3 seconds, a child dies of malaria. So that's 2 babies that died. Every 3 seconds. We have the cure for it. Your government has the cure for it. My government has the cure for it. But yet 10 babies have just died. And most people don't know that. So the international community and big governments and governments like this one have a huge responsibility to help in all of these issues. And some of the sort of notions that then are broken down into broad principles for a successful process are about politically engaging, about being able to do so in a way which is measurable, and it's very useful in that case, though sometimes it can be counterproductive, to set time frames. There needs to be inclusivity. All issues must be on the agenda. This issue of preconditions, there can be no preconditions. I mean, look at what's happening in the Middle East, look what's happening in other you're either about the business of sorting things out, or you're not. And sometimes you can have a process without peace, and it can go on forever and ever, and not serve people at all. And there should be no sort of predetermined outcome. Sometimes governments try to box off talks, but they state the outcome beforehand. And that can be very difficult. As someone who's part of leadership who brought our people into talks, the most difficult negotiation is with your own side. Your own side isn't in the room. I met Tony Blair over a 10-year period, myself and Martin McGuinness, probably more than some of his cabinet colleagues. We got to know him, we were meeting him all the time, we were meeting him for a long time, like for 4 or 5 days in a stretch sometimes. The people who weren't there didn't know him, didn't have the nuances, didn't have the sense of it. And they saw him quite rightly as a British Prime Minister who was responsible for the partition of my country. So going back and trying to persuade your own people of the wisdom and the merits of what you're doing can be very, very daunting. And it isn't always possible to tell your own people everything that's happening, because there are confidentiality and other security elements to all of this. But what is very important that they understand what it's about. They don't need to understand every precise detail, but they need to understand the strategy. And we had some very edifying and uplifting points in our process at big initiative times, where we took big initiatives. And we coined this little phrase, strategic compromises. That you did something which made it easier for your enemy or for your opponent, but it was very painful for your own side. But eventually you got the return. You mightn't have got it. You know, I mean, Ian Paisley doing the deal with me didn't happen overnight. The seeds for that were sown 10 years beforehand, and a whole series of little strategic initiatives which made all of that possible. So people need to understand that, and the edifying points were when at election time we went back out into talk to the Republican base, and they were ahead of us. They knew what was going on. They were watching what was happening and understanding what was happening. And at different points, Republican activists were nervous about going out to talk to our own supporters about what we were doing, to find that our own supporters were ahead of us and were actually empowering the activists to continue with the work. And some of the great moments were during the policing debate recently, when we had big town hall meetings and 1,000 citizens were engaging in strategy. You know, housewives, working people, just ordinary folk, arguing and debating and had their heads around what we were trying to do. So all of those things are crucially important. There's a lot to be done yet. The worst thing in the USA for anyone to think is that the Irish issue has been resolved. It hasn't. We still diligently every single day have to work at the minutiae of the Good Friday Agreement. Big elements of the Good Friday Agreement have not yet been honoured by the British government. Working class Protestants particularly are now much more open to all of these concepts. You know, they've been through the war, they may have reservations about what's going on, but increasingly they want to make friends with their Catholic neighbours. There obviously is resistance to that, and there are people who will never be reconciled to that because some of them are fundamentalists, but broadly speaking, popular opinion. And you can see that in the last election, that the support for the rejectionists was reduced to 4%. Sinn Féin is now the largest party in the north. We are engaged in trying to develop, even in these dire economic times, an economic anchorage for the peace process, because there has to be an ownership by people. It isn't just enough to end conflict, you also have to have justice, and that includes good quality of life, a job, you know, decent health services, all educational access and so on. The British government have been moved to declare that it will leave Ireland when a majority of people in the north decide that that's what they want, and that will legislate for a united Ireland. Rita O'Hara, who is here with me, is the Sinn Féin representative from Ireland who comes here and heads up our political mission. Larry Downs, who I mentioned earlier, heads up Friends of Sinn Féin. And we're now, while sustaining the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement, sustaining the peace process, we're trying to get a national and international conversation about Irish unity, about the right of our people to live free in a society which we shape ourselves. And I say this everywhere I speak, particularly to Irish Americans. I can think of nothing better. If my parents or grandparents or great-grandparents were forced to leave Ireland because of hunger, because of economic necessity, because of conflict, because they were just unable to live in that place, to come back to Ireland, to a free Ireland where people are living together in harmony and with tolerance for each other. So we've just covered in 800 years of history, and I'm very happy to take advice on the next 800 years, or criticism or questions, or to have a discussion around some of these issues. And thank you very, very, very much for listening to me.
About 10 minutes for questions, and here are the ground rules. First public lecture of the year. So one is that we call on students first. The second is that questions should be questions, not statements of opinion. So, and that's really so that we just have more time so more people can hear what our speaker has to say. So I will call on people, and I think there are mics around on the edges. So right here in the center.
Fulton Rowett. I wanted to ask one question around the goals of a United Ireland, which you've referred to in your speech and opening a conversation for a United Ireland. It seems that, despite that being one of Sinn Féin's key goals, Sinn Féin remains stagnant in the Republic. In the south of Ireland, only 4 seats out of 166 in the Southern Parliament, and is on only 25% in, roughly 25 to 30% in the north. So I was wondering, how you think that you can overcome that low level of support. And I just had one second question. Which was no second question.
Well, we have a lot of work to do building Sinn Féin across the island, and I don't minimise the challenges that has for us. The party is sometimes described as being northern. It isn't so much that it's northern; it is that it isn't southern enough. And what we have achieved along with others has been hugely time consuming. I surprised myself. I was writing a book and Richard was doing some research, and what I skipped over there, even to get to John Hume Talks, took 10 years. It's just hugely, you'd be shocked when you look back at, it's 12 years since the Good Friday Agreement. I'm meeting the British Secretary of State on the 7th of October to talk about the Bill of Rights. He says there's not going to be a Bill of Rights. Now the Labour government, which is the last government, pretended and messed and played the fly man with us, but this government, this new Tory Green coalition, just says no, you're not getting a Bill of Rights. So I'm just giving you those as examples of just how time consuming, how exhausting, how focused you have to be and all of that. And we have to continue to develop across the south. But don't think for a moment that Sinn Féin has any monopoly on the United Ireland. The support for United Ireland is much, much, much bigger than Sinn Féin. And how we need to measure Sinn Féin as a party is obviously we want to have maximum support, we want to have as many seats as possible. I don't want to pretend otherwise. But measure us by the changes that we have helped to bring about. So some of the older people here, looking back on what's happened in the last 20 years, 30 years ago, had I came here and said there were going to be ceasefires, Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness would be joint ministers. We would have our own assembly, we would have cross-border structures, we would have peace. People would have sent you to the funny farm, they would have thought it was impossible. Nothing is impossible. So what we have to do in these economic times, for example, look at the adverse effect of partition. You have competing systems, north and south, on nearly every single issue that affects society. And that's an economic burden. And the unionist business class have recognised that. They have bought entirely into the notion of Ireland as a single economic unit. Clearly, the system in the south has failed the people. There is more disenchantment with politics in the south at this time than there is in the north. It isn't even a shadow of the 1916 proclamation. So what we want is a debate which looks at all of that. And we would argue very, very strongly that a national republic is the way to get forward. So I'm not daunted. I'm a party leader who lives in a jurisdiction outside of the republic. And I know I don't spend enough time there. I know that. But I don't spend enough time there because I've spent so much time dealing with the issues of immediate urgent need in the peace process. So we have to keep debating these issues, talking these issues, publicising these issues, and just put it up to Irish people. What sort of society do you want? And here in the US, we launched initiatives, and we want Irish America to come on board and to be part of all of that, and to raise that within your own, universities, forums, municipalities, state legislators in the Capitol Hill. Raise all of these issues there. These are all doable things. There's no reason, with intelligent strategic planning and political will, why we can't live to grow old in a united Ireland. No reason whatsoever.
Why don't we go up here in the back?
Thank you. My name is Angelina Crusoe, and I'm a junior. First of all, I wanted to thank you, Mr. Adams, for your speech and for your recent diplomatic work. I think that's really important. And earlier you had said that there could be no military solution to a political problem, and especially in reflecting on some of the successes in the last 10, 15 years of diplomatic work. If you could, would you have changed some of the military actions taken by the IRA over the last 50 years or so? Do you think that in somehow contributed to maybe a delay in this very successful discourse that has happened?
Yes, I don't have any hang-ups about this. I defend and accept the principle of the IRA's right in a military situation to engage in arms actions, but I've always been critical of those actions, for example, in which civilians were killed or injured. There are other actions which I found unacceptable. So the short answer to your question is yes. But allied to that, in terms of trying to break the cycle, denunciation and condemnation is no substitute for building alternatives. Because my sense of all of this is that sensible people, see there's no, I don't know what the equivalent is here, but there's no Sandhurst, which is the British military, I don't know what you would call your big military establishment here. West Point, there's no West Point within republicanism. Civilians, for a period in their lives, take up armed actions because they feel there's no alternative. But the trick is to get an alternative. And that's what we did. We found an alternative with the assistance of allies, which we made in the process. We found an alternative. And we went to the IRA and we said to them, here's an alternative way to go forward. This is the way you should be doing it. The IRA embraced that. And I think to their great credit, because it is a very difficult thing to sue for peace. Very difficult thing to make that huge leap of faith, of stopping aggressive actions, of stopping hostilities. So I think they deserve credit for doing that. And Seamus Heaney, who some of you know is an Irish poet, he's a Nobel laureate, he described the announcement of the cessation in Ireland as a space in which hope can grow. And there's a similar thing happening in the Basque Country at the moment. And hopefully with these talks starting in the Middle East. So there are spaces opening up in which hope can grow. And I think that's what the IRA, to their credit, allowed to happen, that space to be nurtured and nourished, and the hope to now be what we have.
Okay, we have time for one more question, so why don't we go ahead?
Mr. Adams, I was wondering if you see any potential drawbacks in the current situation of compromise you have reached with the Unionists. For example, Sinn Féin obviously calls itself a democratic socialist party, but what kind of advances has it reached in that direction as a member of the Stormont government?
Well, you cannot have any system of society unless you have autonomy, unless you have control of your own affairs. And we have not yet completely got that. I described in my main remarks that working class unionists were now more open to all of these concepts at any time. And certainly there is more work being done by Sinn Féin people, including myself, in those communities than at any time in my political lifetime. And just bear in mind that we're a society in transition. We've just come out of 30 years of conflict. Before that, we had a one-party state. So I'm quite optimistic and quite confident that ordinary unionists will see more and more, as they do now, that their social and economic well-being lies with people of a similar background. And you'll see that starting to flourish in the period ahead as we continue to engage.
Well, I think we have to end there, so please join me in.
I just want to say this just for a moment. It isn't that the likes of me comes in here and I'm here for an hour and a half, and then I leave again. And I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to address you. And of course, part of coming here is to win support for our cause, and hopeful that someone here, or even 10 people here, may go on to the Sinn Féin webpage, or may pick up on one of the campaign issues, or may become engaged in some way. So that's straight up what we want. We want support for United Ireland. We want support for peace and justice in Ireland. But probably as important as that is just to say to people that every single person here can make a difference. And sometimes with economic recessions, and sometimes with big government, and sometimes just with the burden of living and getting through life, you might miss that. But I mean, Irish Americans reach right into number 10 Downing Street. Right into number 10 Downing Street. People here were able to get a British government to change its position. If the British government, even a benign British government, being left to its own devices, there would still be conflict in Ireland. And you can do that on a whole lot of other issues. And that's why I give that little statistic of one child every 3 seconds dying from a preventable disease. Now, we live in the West. Whatever problems there are in this country, whatever difficulties there are in this country, we're very after it. We've got it good, generally speaking. And to be part of such a wonderful institution as this is a great privilege. So just understand, I'm just an ordinary person who happened to be born in Belfast and blessed with a lot of very, very good friends and associates and heroes and heroines. They have all made a difference. And every single person here can do exactly the same thing, either in your own country, somewhere else in the world, and do it. You don't have to break your heart over it, you don't have to give your own life to it. Just take a wee bit of time out, make a difference for somebody who needs your help. So thanks everyone, we're a minimum.
If you could please remain seated while Gerry Adams and his group leave, and thank you very much for coming.
Reception for Mr. Adams going on in the Schultz cafeteria, and you're all invited to join us there.